Cleveland Torso Murders. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. A string of gruesome, horrifying murders rocked Cleveland, Ohio, from 1934 to 1938. The killer, known as the Butcher of Kingsbury, run after the shantytown where he operated, preyed on the city's homeless population. Due to the bizarre and abnormal nature of the crimes, they have persisted even though they have never been solved. 13 partial corpses were discovered close to Kingsbury over the course of 5 years in Ohio. All had their heads severed, some had their waists cut in half, and some had their genitalia cut off. The victims were both men and women, but they all experienced the Great Depression's economic disparity and resided in the improvised shanties of Kingsbury Run. After all, Capone was found guilty in Chicago. Elliot Ness took over the Cleveland Police Department and, consequently, the investigation into what became known as the Cleveland Torso Murder. Ness, the Cleveland Police Department, and Cleveland's residents were unable to officially identify the unsolved, and they ultimately had to make drastic decisions and give in to the sense of helplessness that a sadistic sexual murder feeds on in order to eliminate the victim pool, if not that victimizer. The Neo-Freudians' groundbreaking work and the study of personality development were tied to the early days of behavioral analysis in 1938. Additionally, the United States had not yet fully incorporated European forensic advancements. Ness and his cohort were woefully unprepared for an unsub like the Butcher, with a fantasy as intricate as Jack the Ripper and selecting victims anonymously like H. And for an unsub like that, Holmes, the law enforcement had no chance. Cleveland, 1934 to 1938. The nation was mired in the Great Depression's financial gloom from 1934 to 1938. Most of the country struggled to find work, and Cleveland, Ohio, and the Midwest seemed to be particularly hard hit. Little improvised settlements appeared all over the nation. The landscape was teeming with shantytowns or buildings made of scrap wood, aluminum, canvas, and cardboard. The new generation of American homeless gathered in these shanty towns and made an effort to create an existence that was, at the very least, similar to their pre-Depression lives prior to the 1929 economic collapse. Crime and alcoholism become more prominent when people gather for economic reasons, as in all times of conflict, and are, for the most part, left to themselves. Kingsbury Run, a slum in Cleveland, was no different. The patched together houses and businesses of Kingsbury Row were occupied by men, women, and kids. There was plenty of downtime due to the lack of work. The downtime gave people many opportunities to feel depressed and unsuccessful. Depression cases offered plenty of justification for alcohol and drug abuse. Elliot Ness, a renowned lawman, had to be called because of the new level of crime that had spread throughout the entire city. Cleveland, the 7th largest city in America, with a population of just under 1 million, got its first glimpse of Elliot Ness in August 1934. Cleveland had developed a reputation as an unruly town due to its high levels of crime and corruption, according to Nickel. Ness was hailed as Cleveland's savior because he had helped bring notorious Al Capone to justice in Chicago years earlier. Unbeknownst to Ness, the Butcher of Kingsbury Run was already active in the most impoverished neighborhood of the vast metropolis and would prove to be a foe that Ness, the largest homicide investigation in the United States at the time, 2,400 officers and the terrified residents of Cleveland, would be unable to overcome. Inspector Cornelius W.W. found fragments of the lady in the lake, the Butcher's first victim. A reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer questioned Cody about whether or not this was the perfect crime. The inspector answered, "No, but it's so close to perfection that we don't know what to do next." Now I will open the gruesome files for you. If these gruesome details are too much for you, you can skip them by chapters in the video. For all others, it goes now into the depths. Victim 1. Name: John Dewitt. Date found: September 23, 1935. Date of death: approximately September 13, 1935. Description: mid-40s, about 5'6" and 165 pounds, white male. Body: John Doe's body was found in relatively plain sight and displayed. He had been decapitated, and cause of death was mid-cervical decapitation. He was also missing his left testicle. His skin had the same red leathery appearance. But with this victim, the unsub had quickly lit the body on fire, searing it. Ligature marks on the victim's wrists indicate that they were bound, and decapitation may have happened while he was awake. John Doe's head was recovered near the body, buried. Victim 2. Name: Edward Andrassy. Date found: September 23, 1935. Date of death: approximately September 20, 1935. Description: 28 years old, 5'11" and 150 pounds, white male. Body: Edward Andrassy was found approximately 30 feet from John Doe 1 on the same day. He had died from a mid-cervical decapitation, complete with ligature marks as well. Like John Doe, Andrassy was emasculated and his genitals were casually discarded in the foliage. Andrassy's head was found buried near the body. Victim 3. Name: Florence Genevieve Polillo. Date found: January 26, 1936. Torso and arms: February 7, 1936. Legs: Date of death: approximately January 25, 1936. Description: 41 years old, 5'4" and 160 pounds, white female. Body: the first pieces of Flo Polillo's body were found behind a marketplace in a small picnic basket, each piece wrapped in newspaper. A two-piece of underwear wrapped in a newspaper was found near Polillo's remains. On February 7, 1936, more of Flo Polillo was found, including her legs. She had died from mid-cervical decapitation and was bisected at the waist. She was dismembered, but the skill used in the bisection and decapitation was not evident in her dismemberment. Her limbs were hacked and wrenched from their sockets. Her head was never found. Victim 4. Name: John Doe, tattooed man. Date found: June 5, 1936. Head: June 6, 1936. Body: Date of death: approximately June 1, 1936. Description: early 30s, 5'11" and 165 pounds, white male. Body: the tattooed man's head was found wrapped in his own bloody clothes. A day later, the rest of this body was found. There was no additional mutilation to the tattooed man's body, but he was killed by a mid-cervical decapitation while awake due to the contraction of the neck muscles. Victim 5. Name: John Doe 3. Date found: July 22, 1936. The only victim killed where found. Date of death: approximately May 1936. Age: approximately 40 years old, 5'5" and 145 pounds, white male. Description: this victim was found decapitated mid-cervical, like other victims. Oddly, this victim was killed where he was found and is the only victim from the west side of Cleveland. The victim's head was found close to the body and wrapped in clothes. The victim was decapitated while still alive and was killed before the tattooed man. Victim 6. Name: John Doe 4. Date found: September 10, 1936. Date of death: September 8 or 9, 1936. Description: mid-20s, 5'10" and 145 pounds, white male. Body: parts of this victim were found in a stagnant pool near the Kingsbury Run area. The cause of death was decapitation, much like the other victims, and this victim was emasculated like Andrassy and John Doe. Unlike the other male victims, the unsolved bisected the torso above the navel. The victim's head was never found. Victim 7. Name: Jane Doe 2. Date found: February 23, 1937 and May 5, 1937. Date of death: February 1921, 1937. Description: 25 to 30 years old, 5'5" to 5'8" and 120 pounds, white female. Body: this victim was found in the same location as victim 0, the Lady of the Lake. Initially, Jane Doe 2's upper torso, minus her arms, was found. It was determined that she was decapitated post-mortem, which is a definite break from the established pattern. Jane Doe 2's lower torso, sans legs, was recovered second. Her head was never found. Victim 8. Name: Rose Wallace. Date found: June 6, 1937. Date of death: approximately June 1936. Description: 40 years old, petite African-American female. Body: Rose Wallace's remains, skull and torso skeleton, was found partially buried in a greasy burlap bag covered in lime. Toe coroner determined that Rose died of mid-cervical decapitation, but no other findings were apparent aside from a missing rib. Oddly, this is the first and only African-American victim, and unlike most of the others, was intentionally hidden. Victim 9. Name: John Doe 5. Date found, July 6, 1937 and July 14, 1937. Date of death, approximately July 4, 1937. Description: approximately 40 years old, 5'8" to 5'10", and 165 pounds, white male. Body: this victim's upper torso was found floating in the Cuyahoga River in a burlap bag, and the lower torso was found 9 days later. The coroner reported the same level of savage rage evidenced by the dismemberment. With this victim, the unsub extracted his organs violently and removed the heart. A piece of the lung was found, but no more organs. The victim's head was never found. Victim 10. Name: Jane Doe 3. Date found, April 8, 1938 and May 2, 1938. Date of death, April 5 or 6, 1938. Description: 20s or 30s, 5 and 120 pounds, white female. Body: Jane Doe 3's left leg was found in April with evidence of an enraged dismemberment. In May, the remaining body parts in a burlap bag were found. The unsub at this point was definitely getting sloppier and a greater deal of rage was evident. Hesitation marks were evidenced as well as what was described as an increasing level of frustration. The head was never found. Victim 11. Name: Jane Doe 4. Date found, August 16, 1938. Date of death, mid-February or April 1938. Description: 30 to 40 years old, 5'4" and 120 pounds, white female. Body: unlike many of the other victims, Jane Doe 3's entire body in pieces was found. Cause of death was determined to be mid-cervical decapitation, and limbs were dismembered at the joint. The body parts were enclosed in boxes and sacks, and her head was found. Jane Doe 3 was found at the same time and in the same location as John Doe 6. Victim 12. Name: John Doe 6. Date found, August 16, 1938. Date of death, December 1937 to February 1938. Description: 30 to 40 years old, 5'10" to 6'0" and 160 pounds, white male. Body: John Doe 6's remains were found at the same time and place as Jane Doe 3. John Doe 6's skeletal upper torso and skull were recovered, and the cause of death was determined as a mid-cervical decapitation. The head was found in a can. Victim 13. Name: Robert Robertson. Date found, July 23, 1950 and July 27, 1950. Date of death, approximately May 1950. Description: late 30s, 6'0" and 160 pounds, white male. Body: much like the earlier crimes, Robert Robertson was decapitated mid-cervical vertebrae. A few of Robertson's limbs were found first, his head and torso 4 days later. Like earlier victims, Robertson had alcohol issues and was unemployed. Cleveland police have an official consensus calling the Robertson a copycat crime, yet all the files for the Robertson murder are housed with the Kingsbury Run files. The profile. The terminology and connotations used in this profile were chosen by the Federal Bureau of Investigation after reviewing John Douglas's sexual homicide. Patterns and motives. Age. The unsub is somewhere between 30 and 40 years old when the canonical murders take place. He would have to develop the fantasy to the point where he is decapitating and severing the bodies of his victims, depending on the age of the victims and the relative sophistication of the crimes. The unsub must own a vehicle for transportation. The unsub would need to have access to and control over a vehicle in order to get to the dump sites, sometimes multiple locations for a single victim. That would typically imply that the unsub would be wealthier than his victims in the context of these crimes. Having a car and driving it during the Great Depression indicated that you had a job, and a good one at that. The unsub can therefore be assumed to be professional if not wealthy. Using the primitive public transportation available at the time to dispose of corpses and pieces is absurd. In the Kingsbury Run crowd, he blends in and doesn't make a big impression. He either assists others while working there or adopts a false identity to blend in. The unsub is physically capable of controlling intoxicated men and women and disposing of their bodies in various locations around the city. He is strong enough to use hand tools to dismember a body and separate someone's head from the rest of their body. He's a right-handed white man who stands at just under 6 feet. EQ. The unsub is a very smart person. He is familiar with both police procedure and anatomy. No matter who he chooses as his victims, his fantasy is well developed, and he likes to tease the media and the police. His body language occasionally reveals an intelligent prankster who relishes the silliness of his game. But there is some sense of regret. Most of the heads that have been discovered have been wrapped, covered, or buried, showing that he did not want to see them again. Although the first two men's heads were buried, the graves were only 2 heads deep. Rose Wallace, the lone African-American victim, was buried farther underground than the others in a burlap bag. That might suggest that she died with additional levels of shame. Uncertainty exists regarding the unsub's feelings toward having a relationship with or killing an African American. The unsub most definitely resides in the vicinity of Kingsbury Run. He is familiar with Cleveland in general, but especially with the impoverished neighborhoods surrounding the shantytown. Despite being the first victim identified, the Lady of the Lake is not a reliable indicator of the unsub's location because it is clear that he is mobile and willing to be as patient as possible when disposing of victims over a long period of time in a wide area. This unsub is unquestionably organized, to use the language of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There is a glaring lack of evidence, and the murder weapon and ligature are removed from the scene. Known prostitutes, jobless alcoholics, and small-time criminals make up the victim pool. Since the unsub's ruse or con was so well developed, even though each of these people had become accustomed to the realities of street life, they found themselves at his mercy. He had a very elaborate ritual fantasy that, it seems, culminated in a beheading. With the exception of victim 5, the unsub committed the murders elsewhere than where he disposed of the bodies. Along with the limb breadcrumb trails the unsub occasionally left, the bodies were also staged. In order to dispatch his victims, he had a sizable, quiet, and remote space. The other victims were drunk, but only victim 10 had signs of drug use in her system. It is conceivable that the unsub lures his victims with alcohol, which would imply a ruse. The unsub is unquestionably intelligent and well organized. Motive. It is obvious that the unsub targeted high-risk victims due to their habitation. They won't be overlooked, and extrapolating from that, it is reasonable to assume they won't be found and brought back to him. The evidence of ligature marks and the unusualness of a decapitation show that the unsub takes his time with his victims. As his career progressed, the unsub's level of rage increased steadily, as shown by his mutilations. From cutting around joints to wrenching arms out of sockets, from no mutilation to complete evisceration, etc. He changed his methods over time. Bisection of victims was only used on female victims in his early murders, while genital mutilation was only used on male victims. The unsub, however, started to broaden his scope of thought at the point of the second lady in the lake. Decapitation, bisecting, and mutilation, when evident, started to become common practices. However, the victims' heads being covered or wrapped as a sign of remorse is unusual.
What are your thoughts on this spawn of hell? Write them to me in the comments.
Conclusions of profile. Elliot Ness should have been searching for an aid worker, physician's assistant, or even a doctor who donated time to the slums of Kingsbury Run in light of the aforementioned profile. The unsub would appear sympathetic toward the squalor of the shantytown residents while secretly detesting their way of life. It would be reasonable to assume that the unsub grew up in a neighborhood similar to a Kingsbury Run with a mother and father who had less money. The unsub is using his victims to vent his hatred toward his parents, both of them. He is aware of the problems caused by prostitution, drug abuse, and alcoholism. He might even think he is rescuing them. By ritually severing the women through the abdomen, they kept them from using their polluted wombs. Some of the men's genitalia are cut off and removed before being carelessly ignored, which suggests that the unsub is aware of the suffering these men have endured because of their genitalia. The unsub is fully aware that eradicating their filthy bodies is necessary to save these morally bankrupt people. It is conceivable that the unsub's statement about saving the victims is another reason why the heads of the victims were wrapped or covered. The unsub is proud of his achievements and orchestrates the discovery of many of his victims despite showing signs of remorse. These discoveries range from serious to relatively playful. For instance, he passed off Flo Padillo's body parts as a delivery of meat. The Dahlia tragic. And finally, the 1947 murder of the Black Dahlia in California has occasionally been linked to the butcher of Kingsbury Run. That rumor will be debunked by a quick review of the crime scene and victimology. The Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short, was a 22-year-old aspiring actress. She had been cut in half just below the navel and discovered in a Los Angeles park. She was shockingly shown off naked and suffering from deep facial wound. The butcher of Kingsbury Run may be cleared based solely on the examination of this data. The lacerations on Short's face indicate that the person who killed her knew her well enough to be furious at her. Short is much younger than the butcher's victims and is a young, aspiring actress. Very different from the occasionally homeless, nearly homeless women that the butcher favored. Similar to the butcher, there was no limb dismemberment.
If you like this video, leave a subscription to never miss a serial killer again.